Mithridates the Great, the Indomitable, and the Poison King. Hey guys, what's up? And in this video, I'm going to be doing a documentary on Mithridates, the 6th of Pontus. Now, before we can get into Mithridates the 6th, we need to figure out where he came from. And he came from a pretty big bloodline of a bunch of people named Mithridates. And so his father, Mithridates the First, founded Pontus. He founded the kingdom of Pontus, or Pontus. That's the Greek way of saying it. I will be using the English way. He founded it near the Black Sea, northern part of Asia Minor, after the death of Alexander the Great. So after the founding of the kingdom of Pontus, Mithridates the First really doesn't do much more than that. However, Mithridates the Second, when he came to power, he took a few coastal towns like Sinope and Trapezos. And then Mithridates the Third comes to power, and at this point, no one really knows what happens. In fact, it is said that Pontus might have even been destroyed. They don't really know. Nothing covers this. There's no sources to find anything about Mithridates the Third. However, Mithridates the Fourth, he is a bit more aggressive, but still quite passive. He doesn't really do much. Now this is where things get a bit more action-packed. Pharnacus the First comes to power in Pontus, and he does not hide the Mithridatic army. He marches out and takes a few towns around the area, and then this is where Pontus first comes into contact with Rome, and that is when he takes Phalegonia. Rome was not having this, and they sent an emissary to Pharnacus the First, and not having the manpower and resources, Pharnacus reluctantly agrees and pulls out of Phalegonia. And would you believe the father of Mithridates the Sixth is Mithridates the Fifth? Mithridates the Fifth comes to power, and once again, not really much happens. In fact, he kinda is again a bit passive. Pharnacus the First was honestly the only one who was actually that aggressive and used their army to the utmost power. And the moment you've all been waiting for, Mithridates the Sixth. Mithridates the Sixth was born in Sinope, and it was said that when he was born, a comet flew over. Now, this could be over-exaggerated. However, it is confirmed by the Han Dynasty of China. Now, that's actually kind of pretty cool if you think about it, because if this is true, the same thing would have happened with Jesus of Nazareth. When he was born, there was the Star of David. And another story surrounding Mithridates' birth is that it was said he was hit by lightning. Now, 2 of 3 people survived lightning strikes, so it isn't all that unbelievable. However, it probably wasn't true, honestly. Now, something that was true was that it was said his bloodline, besides the other Mithridates and Pharnacus, it was said that his ancestors were Alexander the Great and Cyrus the Great, and it was said that he actually inherited Alexander the Great's cloak. Now, obviously, I'm not going to get into whether these arguments are true or not. We are going to go right into what Mithridates did. Now, Mithridates as a kid, he was quite adventurous to say the least. He was like the Robin Hood of ancient times. And something he did for fun, which I don't know how fun it would be, but he would go out and hunt animals, like dangerous animals that would possibly kill you in any situation. He would do dangerous stuff like this for most of his childhood, and apparently he considered it fun. Now, something that is very close to Alexander the Great's upbringing is something that Mithridates did. And apparently, at the age of 10, he tamed a wild horse, which is not easy, and for the age of 10, it's pretty impressive, actually. Now, this just goes to show Mithridates' daringness and bravery. And as soon as Mithridates was gonna come to power, he fled from his kingdom. And the reason for this is because he thought his mother and other conspirators were trying to kill him, which is very probable, as that time of history that happened a lot. And here is one of the most fascinating parts about Mithridates that I absolutely love. And while he was basically exiled from his kingdom for a few years, he wandered the countryside, meeting the people, exploring the land. But something that he did is he took small doses of poison. Now, this is very, very life-threatening and is not recommended. But he was so afraid of being poisoned that he wanted to become immune to it, and it worked. After a few years of taking poison doses, very small, he became immune to it. And now, at the age of 17, Mithridates went back to his homeland with a few followers and took his throne, imprisoned his mother, and then had her killed. Now, this was a big part in history as Mithridates was in power, and he was hungry for land, and he wasn't going to back down from anybody. And Mithridates got right to work. Basically, immediately, he took his army, and he took the town of Colchis, and that is to the northeast of Pontus, also on the Black Sea, a town there. And then he marched to Armenia Minor, and basically demanded the settlement, and they had no choice but to give it to him. Now, if you don't know where Armenia Minor is, it's basically to the southeast of Pontus, and the reason the Armenians didn't really do anything about this is because they had trouble with the Parthians still trying to gain their freedom, and so they let Mithridates have the kingdom. And if there was to be a war against Armenia and Pontus, I think Pontus would have won pretty easily. And this is where Mithridates gets a lot of territory. And that is when he attacked the Scythians, and basically helping, quote-unquote, the Bosphorian Greeks to gain their freedom from the Scythians. However, right after that, he took the Bosphorus and occupied a huge chunk of territory. Now, the Greeks didn't really like this, but there wasn't much they could do about it. He was too strong at this point and already proved his skill in warfare. And then, after he took the Bosphorus, he took the small town of Olbia, occupied that, and then he went to the western side of the Black Sea and took a few towns over there, and that is where he stops occupying territory. So now that Mithridates is done with expansion, you may sit here and think to yourself, is this all that he's been able to accomplish before he goes to war with Rome? Well, no, that is not all he will accomplish. Mithridates begins his diplomacy, and he starts with Armenia and the Seleucid Empire. Now, these are both two very powerful kingdoms, and they would be both useful allies. So he sends some diplomats to Seleucids, getting some treaties with them. But mostly what he does is he marries one of his daughters off to Tigranes II of Armenia, and he would go on to expand the Armenian kingdom pretty big, and he would also help Mithridates in the Mithridatic Wars. So at this point, he needed a way to get his money. He needed more money, basically. And the way he does this is he prints off his own coinage, just like Tigranes II did, and a lot of Eastern kingdoms did. So he's able to print off his own coins, make his basically own his own money, and with that he is able to get any army size he wants to. He can get tons of troops, hundreds of thousands of troops, a giant fleet. And you're probably thinking, what is Rome doing at this point, and why haven't they done anything to Mithridates? Well, they couldn't. They had a lot of problems. They had just finished off the Punic Wars and the Hannibalic War, and Italy was still recovering from that war. They had Sulla to deal with, and he was just being ridiculous and not going down without a fight. And Mithridates makes the move that would change history forever. He attacks Cappadocia, and there really wasn't even a war. He just denounced the king and put his own king on there. And Rome wasn't having this, and they ordered him to get out, and he did, because he didn't really want to have a war with Rome just yet, but eventually he would have to. So Mithridates obviously wasn't happy with losing Cappadocia, and he was not going to let it slide. And later he would have Tigranes II, his son-in-law, attack Cappadocia and do the same thing he did before, and Rome did what they did before. They ordered him to leave Cappadocia, and he did again. This is where the relationship between Rome and Pontus completely disappears, and Rome provokes Nicomedes of Bithynia to start raiding Pontus, and he does it. And Mithridates, being as bold as he was, provoked the Romans by taking Cappadocia. And Mithridates sent an emissary to Rome saying, "I will leave Cappadocia if you tell Nicomedes to stop raiding my territory." And this was the last straw. The First Mithridatic War began. Now, before we can actually get into the war, we need to go over the troops. Now, Mithridates at that time was said to have had 150,000 soldiers. Now, this is a bit of an over-exaggeration, but it isn't all that impossible because he had a lot of people in his land and he could easily have done it. Now, Rome in that area had 175,000 soldiers. So they outnumbered Pontus, but they 100% did not outmatch him. Before we get into the fighting, I need to tell you what type of troops Pontus would have been able to field at that time. Now, Mithridates' army was big and it was also elite. This army had been fighting for years against different types of armies. But there was a problem. It was the Hellenistic style. And in my opinion, that's the worst possible style to fight against Rome. But let's get into his army. At the front of the line, screening the force, we have the Peltast. Now, these guys are what you probably think. However, Pontus had heavier Peltast. These guys could fight in melee a little bit, but they would mainly rush forward, toss their javelins, and they could also repulse cavalry attacks if needed. They were very strong units. In the center, he had the Phalangites, the main core of the army, the pikemen. These guys could basically hold up against almost anything, but they weren't good for offensiveness. And now we have the cavalry. He would have had a ton of cavalry, probably around 10,000. And the reason he had this is because around Pontus there are tons of different types of cavalry you can recruit. There are Celtic mercenaries, there's Scythians, there are Cappadocians, there are Phalagonian cav, and there's the Pontic native cav. He could have had a pick between all of these, and there were also Thracian and Sarmatian cavalry in the area. So he would have been able to easily recruit thousands of cavalry, and it would come in handy. Then you would have had the skirmishers, basic archers and slingers that sat in the back and used their weapons, or supported cavalry, either one. They were pretty effective. They had also seen years of fighting, so they were pretty good units. Next up in the Pontic line, we have the Brazen Shields. These guys were basically like the Silver Shield Pikes. They were just the elite version of pikemen. They were pretty elite, and we will see them in the Mithridatic Wars coming up. And now, for the dreaded Scythed Chariots. These were a very elite unit, and they can take out a whole army, or they can kill your army. The Pontic chariots were actually extremely elite since they had been fighting for years. Now, chariots in Asia Minor were kind of a question because there were so many mountains and the terrain just wasn't that good for them. However, if they were deployed on a flat terrain and could get the speed and wind up they needed to, they can destroy a whole entire army. And finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, the war in Asia Minor. Mithridates was gonna get to work when his spies reported a Nicomedean army coming for him. Now, he didn't believe it was a full invasion, as the Nicomedians could only assemble about 40,000 troops. So he sent the brothers Archelaus and Neotopolis to go check out the area. And to their surprise, it was an invasion force. 40,000 Nicomedians moving in to fight Pontus. So at first, the battle started with the Pontic Peltas rushing forward and pelting the Bithynians. Now, the Pontic troops didn't actually have any heavy infantry. They only had Peltas, chariots, and cavalry. And they had about 600 chariots, and they were held in reserve. Now, the Pontic cavalry, seeing an opportunity, weaved behind the Bithynian army and got to a hill up behind them. And then, when the peltis were open in an open plain, the chariots moved forward, and the Bithynians, horrified by the scene of the chariots ripping through their soldiers, blood going everywhere, guts spilling out, intestines being dragged on the chariots, men cut in half, the Bithynians broke. The battle was won by Pontus. And the best part about this whole battle is that after Neoptolemus and Archelaus captured the baggage train of Nicomedes, Pontus's army grew because the mercenaries who basically said whoever has the money, they're going to join. And Pontus had the money, so they joined Pontus's side. Mithridates' army actually grew after this battle. Now, you may think this is just a normal battle that Pontus won. However, what this did was boost the Pontic morale extremely high. The Pontic army just destroyed a bigger and better army than itself, with just a fraction of what Mithridates had. The Romans, who were thinking of only fighting a maybe half morale army, had to fight a sky-high Pontic army that was not going to back down. Nicomedes, after losing, fell back to Bithynia and met up with Aquilius, who was in the area, but he only had a few thousand troops, and Mithridates with his whole army marched on them, and at the Battle of Protopacium, they were again defeated. Mithridates would later kill Aquilius by pouring molten gold down his throat, just like the general Serena at the Battle of Carrhae years later would do to Crassus. And Mithridates didn't stop there. He moved on, and chasing Lucius Cassius out of Asia, he pushed that army out. And Quintius Oppius tried to hide behind Laodicea, but the citizens surrendered him to Mithridates, and he killed him. And with the campaign of 89 BC complete, Mithridates had pushed Roman rule completely out of Asia Minor. And he gained huge support as he decided for the citizens, for loyalty reasons, he would not tax them for the first 5 years of governorship over them. And Mithridates had a huge fleet of 300 ships, and he wasn't going to let Rome get to Asia Minor. And he was expecting a massive Roman army to come and attack Asia Minor. However, that never came because Rome had too many political problems going on. They couldn't get an army over there. And Sulla also had political problems going on, so he couldn't move his army over there. Mithridates was in the best possible position he ever could be. And Mithridates, once again, was not going to rest. He immediately got to work. And, in one of the worst possible scenes in human history, he ordered the execution of 80,000 Italian citizens. Now, you may think this is a bad idea because it could make the Romans mad and they could send twice the forces over, but actually it wasn't. It was a great idea. Killing their population will kill their armies. If they have no time to train them, then they won't have an army in the time. Mithridates was a genius, and he just proved it right here. Now, the reason historians make this event seem so big is because it was. Mithridates kept this a secret between all the Asia Minor governors. And it's near impossible to do something like that without someone getting word of it, but he did it. Mithridates was a flippin' genius. He could think of anything in any situation, and once again, he does it. He kicked Rome out of Asia Minor and completely destroyed their influence of the area. There were basically no Italians in Asia Minor. Mithridates just undid years of work from Rome with just one flick of his fingers. This was not going to settle easy back in Rome. After Mithridates took over most of Asia Minor, the reason I say most is because there is still an unconquered part, and that's Rhodes. Mithridates needed to get Rhodes out of the picture. And getting his army, he went over there with his 300 warships and a massive army. He besieged the town. However, in a few skirmishes on the seaside, Mithridates lost a few skirmishes there, and he couldn't actually take the cities, so he eventually just ended up abandoning it. It wasn't really that big of a deal, and it was his first time commanding an army, so you can't really hate on him here. Back in Rome, they finally managed to get something together, and they sent Sulla over into Greece, and Greece didn't really like the Romans, so they invited Mithridates over, and Mithridates sent Archelaus over, and the two would meet in Greece. So Mithridates' thinking here is, why fight a war in Asia Minor when we can keep it rich? We can fight a war in Greece and make them pay. And that was actually really smart thinking. Keep them out of Asia Minor, keep the territory rich and clean, because in that time of history, fighting a war on your territory was actually really, really devastating. And so he didn't want to do it. He decided to go to Greece. Now, before any fighting actually started, it took Sulla a while to get there, so Archelaus conquered all the way up to Pella. However, when he got to Pella, there were 2 legions there blocking him, so he decided just to turn around and camp in the southern Greece area, and Sulla finally arrived with his legions. He didn't have much, in fact, he had a tiny army. However, the Mithridatic army wasn't actually there yet. Archelaus only had a few thousand troops, so he decided to fall back to Athens, and the party there, the anti-Roman party, decided to let them stay in, so Archelaus camped in the port, and the city was besieged by Sulla. So Sulla sieged Athens and the port next to it. However, Mithridates wouldn't supply Athens. He would only supply Archelaus in the port of Athens. And this is a big mistake because the Athenians started starving very quickly. They didn't have enough food for a siege. And eventually, after a few months, the city fell. However, Archelaus, using his fleet, he managed to get out of the port and get to Euboea, where he met up with the main Mithridatic army. The fight was about to begin. Now, the numbers of the battle I'm about to tell you are probably so over-exaggerated that it isn't even funny. It is said that Archelaus has 100,000 soldiers, 10,000 horses, and 90 scythed chariots, compared to Sulla's army, which was only 15,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavalry, and 5,000 of which were Greek supporters. Now, you're probably wondering what is the name of the battle that I'm about to tell you, and it's the Second Battle of Chaeronea, exactly where Philip of Macedon took down the Greek forces. Now, Archelaus was first to the battlefield. He had a small hill garrison to the right of the Pontic forces called Mount Thurium. To the left of the Pontic forces were the river Cephisus, and further to the left was Mount Hedaileum, and back to that, behind them, was Mount Acontium. Now, this is a really big tactical error. Archelaus, even if the forces were over-exaggerated, put himself in such a tight area with such a big force that it was impossible for him to make his numbers use well. However, if you're Pontus and you think defeat is even possible in this situation, you must be insane. The Pontic army was huge. Again, even if it was over-exaggerated, Sulla only had a small force compared to what Pontus had. The Pontic army was drew up in a pretty ordinary Hellenistic style. Phalanx in the middle, peltasts in front, skirmishers behind, some mercenary swords to the left, brazen shields to the left of the phalanxes, cavalry in front of the brazen shields, and the mountain garrison on the far right. Now, the way the Roman forces were set up were legions in the front, Greek allies to the back of the legions, Murena on the far left with a few thousand soldiers and some cavalry, and Sulla with whatever else he could spare on the far right. The fighting started when Murena, on the far left of the Roman army, began dropping boulders on the mountain garrison, and this pushed them back. Completely confused, they fled, taking about 3,000 casualties. The first blood went to Rome. Archelaus ordered the scythed chariots forward. However, they couldn't get enough speed as they were clumped in the small space, and Sulla just told his men to open the lines, and he had javelin men ready, and when the chariots passed harmlessly through, they tossed their javelins and the chariots were off the battlefield. Archelaus then led his cavalry through the gap. His pikemen had pinned down the Roman legions, and that's exactly what he wanted. All he had to do was strike them in the back and the battle would be over. However, to his horror, Hortensius came up with his Greek allies and blocked the cavalry. Archelaus charged them, however they were braced, and they barely took any casualties except for a few scratches. Now, Murena's smirk must have wiped off his face, as, during the panic, Taxiles brought up the brazen shields and attacked the legions under Murena's control. This must have shocked Murena, to see brazen shield pikemen walking through panicking troops and still engaging the Roman forces. The fighting on the right side of the battle was starting to add up. Now that Sulla was distracted fighting the brazen shields on the right, Archelaus decided to try his hand at the left. He used his cavalry to skirt around his own soldiers, but to his horror, his line was too big, and he couldn't get around his soldiers in time. And Sulla, being a veteran commander, predicted this movement and had his cavalry ready, and hit Archelaus' cavalry before they could charge. His cavalry was pushed back to the fort. Now, to Sulla's horror, Archelaus managed to rally the cavalry and turn them and brace for the oncoming Romans. These were elite cavalry, and they were trained to fight to the death. However, the Romans, being just as elite, managed to beat them off, and the cavalry was completely wiped out. Now, Sulla rushed to see how Murena was doing, and to his delight, he saw the routing brazen shields off of the field. Then Sulla, using the rest of his legions and cavalry, surrounded the Phalangites, and the whole entire army was almost completely wiped out. So you're probably wondering what the casualties for this battle were, because the armies were both elite and the Pontic army was massive. Well, by Sulla's own words, it said that the Romans and Greeks lost 14 men. Like, 14 guys, that's it. And the Pontic army lost 100,000. Now, that's insane to me, in my opinion. Because you gotta think about the cavalry fighting, the infantry fight at least was something. Like, more than 14 guys died, in my opinion. Sulla at least had to take a few hundred casualties. Maybe a little bit less, but that's just my opinion. Now, Mithridates, back in Asia Minor, was gathering more troops. He was talking to the locals. He was giving out speeches, trying to turn them to his side. But these people were not loyal. They were businessmen. They were going to switch to whoever side was winning. They didn't want to lose their lives in this war. And Mithridates knew that, so he knew he had to keep the Romans out of Asia Minor. When Mithridates got the word that his army was destroyed, he must have panicked. And so did his territory, because some of his holdings near the coast rebelled. However, he gathered an army and crushed them very easily. Archelaus managed to escape to Euboea, and Mithridates sent another army to him, which you're gonna see is not gonna be the greatest idea. Now, on the Roman side, Sulla was having a lot of problems, because Archelaus decided to use the Fabian strategy and not engage his army, and his army was on the verge of disbanding because they didn't really like Sulla and they were tired of fighting. They wanted to go home. And another problem Sulla had is the Romans sent Flaccus with an army. Now, this dude's an idiot, I just gotta say. He is a complete idiot, and within a few months, his army mutinies and kills him. And they eventually just go off into Asia Minor, and we will see them later. Archelaus decided it was time to fight Sulla again. Sulla knew he wanted an open field, and he gave that to them. Archelaus thought he had this battle in his hands, but Sulla put him in a trap. Archelaus had an army of 90,000 soldiers. These were brought over by Dorylaeus from Asia Minor. These were not veteran soldiers, they were pretty crappy actually, but they would do the job if Sulla could use them correctly. Sulla was near the town of Orchomenus, and Archelaus, seeing this as an open field, would take to it, and this would be his biggest mistake. Archelaus wasn't gonna go down without a fight though, and the Romans, who were trying to build trenches to stop Archelaus' cavalry, Archelaus couldn't allow this to happen because his cavalry was his best unit, and when the Romans came out to build, he rushed his cavalry out of the gate, and the Romans, panicked by the sight of the amount of thousands of Pontic cavalry, ran for their camp, and they were cut down into pieces. The battle was almost lost before it had even began. But here is where Sulla's genius comes into play. Jumping up to the earthworks and bellowing at his wavering troops, Sulla yells, "Orchomenus, remember the name. I am ready to fight and die here. When people ask you where you ran away and left your general, tell them at Orchomenus." Archelaus' cavalry kept the Romans pinned in the camp. However, more and more Romans came out, and it was probably at this point that Archelaus' son, Diogenes, died in combat. The cavalry was eventually pushed back, and the Romans pushed into the Pontic archers, who fired a volley and pushed the Romans back to their camp. Now, Archelaus, seeing Sulla construct the earthworks, couldn't allow him to do this, like I said before, and he brought out his whole entire army, scythe chariots in the front, phalangites behind them, escaped slaves behind them. These were armed in the Roman style, so they would do pretty well. Cavalry on the flanks and skirmishers behind that. Archelaus's cavalry was on the flanks. However, because of the earthworks Sulla made, they were basically unusable at this point. However, they would still be on the battlefield. Sulla's army was arranged in 3 lines. In between these lines were wooden stakes to try and keep the scythe chariots back. And in between the infantry were light infantry and even cavalry, which would be used to rush in if they were needed. The chariots rushed forward once again, and once again they failed miserably. As the Romans stepped aside, javelins were thrown forward, they hit the stakes, and they turned around and hit their own phalanx troops, causing a mass of panic and chaos. Archelaus had a little choice but to rush his cavalry into the fray and try to pin the Romans down. But Sulla, foreseeing this move as he was a veteran commander, had moved his own little bit of cavalry to block the Pontic cavalry, and it was almost immediately overwhelmed. However, it stood long enough for the Roman infantry to engage the Pontic cavalry, and they were immediately cut down into pieces. Now, so far as the battle wasn't over, but so far, the casualties for Pontus were 10,000 cavalry and only 5,000 infantry. He still had a lot of infantry, and they would be used very well coming up, but his cavalry was off of the field. The Romans the next day then besieged the Pontic camp and began building earthworks. However, Archelaus wasn't going to let this happen, and he stated that the Romans had the audacity to put us under siege while being outnumbered almost 2-1, and his forces were determined to beat the enemy. Surging out of the camp, they attacked the Roman forces, but these were veteran soldiers and they had only seen victory. Sulla, being an experienced commander, easily kept his men together, and they pushed the Pontic forces back in the camp. Eventually, the Pontic camp was taken, and all the soldiers were killed inside. Now, this is not the only time we're going to see high-spirited Pontic soldiers. These men, as their camp was about to fall, fought shoulder to shoulder and tried to keep the Roman forces back. But Sulla's army, like I said before, was elite. It was not going to be beaten by these basic soldiers. However, they were high-spirited. Even in the face of defeat, they held on and tried to win. Archelaus got in a boat and went back to Euboea. He was not ready for Mithridates to hear the news of another defeat. Mithridates got the news of another defeat by Archelaus, and to his dismay, his holdings rioted again, and there was nothing he could do about it this time. He didn't have an army, and he wasn't in the position to fight more rebels, so he had to let them pull off and switch back to Rome. Now, you're probably wondering about the army that I talked about earlier that was controlled by Flaccus. Well, like I said before, they mutinied, killed Flaccus, and put up Fimbria. He was a pretty good commander. Not really much happened with them. They just marched into Asia Minor and started raiding the place. Mithridates managed to get another army, and he put it under the control of Dorylaeus and sent it against the Fimbrian army. However, that was defeated. The Pontic army lost, and then Sulla came into Asia Minor and defeated the Fimbrian army. And eventually, Mithridates had to sue for peace, and he had to give up all of what he conquered, so all of Asia Minor, 80 ships, and pay a war indemnity. This is just the first part of Mithridates. Now, this war may have seemed like a bad thing for Mithridates, which it was. He lost 160,000 soldiers, more than that actually, but yeah, he lost a lot of soldiers. He lost some of his fleet, but he proved to the Romans he was not going to go down easily. He already stood up to them when he took back Cappadocia, and that was not something the Romans liked. They didn't like people actually standing up to them and doing what they want. My friends, this is just the first part of Mithridates' story. In the next video, I will cover the second and third Mithridatic wars, and that is going to be a fun one, as for decades, Mithridates would take on the Romans. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. This was my first time ever doing a documentary, so it was pretty fun. It was definitely not what I expected. It took a long time, a lot longer than I thought it would, but I managed to get it done. So, like I said before, I'm going to be doing the second and third Mithridatic wars in my next video, and I hope you all enjoyed this. Thank you for watching.